Hasan Minhaj. You guys know him now, if you didn't before. Um, and I'm going to talk to you about him. Good stuff. Like, really good stuff. I had to apologize. I just felt guilty in class because we watched the whole thing. The whole thing was like, an hour and 15 minutes or something. Like we didn't really have any time to discuss it. But I as I mentioned to class, like I, I was looking through it like, okay, what could I take out? And I feel like there isn't a second of that show that you could take out and have it feel the same. I kind of thought, it's not doing justice to him and, the work if I'm just taking little clips and cutting it up. Um, so I feel like that was, it has to be seen from start to finish. And a bunch of you mentioned this in the comments, like, this isn't a series of jokes, right? It's not just like where you can pull out some that aren't great or aren't really, or just kind of filler jokes, throwaway jokes, as Sarah Silverman would call them. This is a narrative, right? This is one story that he makes funny and heartbreaking, and um, yeah, it's a totally different approach to comedy, really. Um, Other comedians tell stories, but they're usually for the jokes. I feel like this is the other way around. The jokes are for the story, if that makes any sense. They're to enhance the story, which goes back to the whole Carlin thing about the jokes should adorn the ideas. Like the story stands on its own. He just is choosing to make it funny for you, for us as a you know. So his his career arc is interesting because he was doing, he started as a stand up, really, and he mentions in the special um, that he got hired at the Daily Show to be a correspondent. That sort of launched him. That gave him the clout or the creative freedom to do Homecoming King, which is what we watched. And since then, he sort of, you combine those two, right? His time on the Daily Show with Homecoming King and just his personality and his charisma and his sense of humor, and it naturally, I think, translates into something like Patriot Act, which is in the same vein as Last Week Tonight with John Oliver on HBO. Um, a comedy news show, basically, that really digs into topics that we largely take for granted, um, and ideas and concepts and things like that. So Patriot Act, I think, is this interesting extension of his identity and his comedy. Um, so what about Homecoming King? Um, I keep going back to this. It's fucking crazy how this stuff works. I've been teaching this stuff for 15, 16 years. And thanks to you guys, thanks to students and the ever changing content in my relationship and understanding of it, there's constantly new ideas are coming to the forefront for me. And this semester, it's been this idea of the distinction between ex- exploration versus exploitation. I think I talked about it maybe in your class, but I'll talk about it again. I don't care. Um, there's a fun, there's a fundamental difference between those two things, right? Some comedy explores, some comedy exploits. You can almost put everything you see into one of those two categories. It's rarely doing both, right? And um, it's been this epiphany for me this semester, and it keeps sort of popping up in all three of my classes. I've talked about it, and Hasan Minhaj is a perfect example of he in this special he is exploring the immigrant experience, meaning giving it shape, giving it depth, not just exploiting it for laughs and doing, oh, brown people are hilarious and their parents are like this, and, you know, all the stereotypes, right? That's exploitative comedy. He's doing exploratory comedy, where it's like, I want to explore what it means to be a, a person of color, an immigrant, who has immigrant, or at least has immigrant parents. I want to explore that, to relate it to those who don't maybe share that experience or understand that experience, and to relate to those who do, right? To be a voice for those people, not to continually undercut that experience by exploiting it for personal gain, popularity, or laughs, or whatever it is. And I think it's pretty easy to sort of categorize comedy as exploratory or exploitative. And the example, and again, I apologize if I've said this to you guys before, but the example where it really came to light was in my TV class. We're watching Master of None with Aziz, and that whole show is an exploration of what it means to be brown in America on a sitcom, basically. So like that's exploration. The flip side of it, the exploitation part, is something like Raj from Big Bang Theory, who exists on that show for the sole purpose of being the butt of all the Indian jokes. So exploiting the only reason he's on that show is to be Indian and to have access to all those hilarious jokes, stereotypes. And he sort of confirms or perpetuates all of them in virtually every episode. He does the accent, and all of his entire function is to be Indian on the show and be exploited. Like, that's exploiting. We don't know anything about his character, really. They don't care about that. They're exploiting his Indianness for laughs and whatever you want to call it. So you can start to see that, like, Hasan Minhaj is exploring this, not exploiting this. And I'm honestly, like, this semester has been awesome because it's just totally reframed a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about for years. So the exploitation versus the exploration of race and the immigrant experience, he is exploring it quite in depth. right? Sparing no details. Um, and he's not like many other comedians who use their otherness to exclude. Like it seems like a lot of black comedians, or even the one I thought of initially was George Lopez, who sort of wears his Mexicanness like armor and really is only speaking to, if you watch any of George Lopez's stuff, I know he's kind of older. He hasn't done, I don't know if he's done a special in a while, but a lot of his stuff is, we're Mexican, get the fuck out of the way, you don't understand, right? Like nobody understands us, which is, I understand that sentiment and that feeling, but he's not doing anything to help us understand, right? He's not really exploring that. It's sort of, he wants to exclude the rest of the world from his community. Whereas I think Minaj wants to his open us up to his community and who he's speaking for in this case. Um, so that I thought was an interesting parallel. Um, there's the there's a pretty obvious connection to like Bo Burnham in, and a bunch of you mentioned it, his use of technology, right? He has the big screens in the back. If you watch Patriot Act, it's even more so. Um, but the use of technology and production value and camera positioning and camera angles and things like that um, is pretty new. You know, Burnham, Bo Burnham kind of, I guess, broke the mold. And it makes sense. You know, Hasan Minhaj is, he's young. You know, he's a 90s. Is he? Yeah. He's a 90s kid. I think he's like your age. Well, no, he's probably like 30 now, I guess. This is very easy to look up. Um, but yeah, he's probably in his 30s. Whatever. Doesn't matter. But you can see his, you know, the way he uses technology and um, different production techniques in this special is, it's, I think it's compelling, right? Um, Not nearly as reliant on it as Bo Burnham is, but certainly it enhances the performance. Um, you know, this is another laugh at my pain situation, right? Um, and I'm pretty confident that you can see the difference between Hasan Minhaj and Kevin Hart, who, yeah, laugh at my pain. I think you can see the difference. Um, this is part of this confessional comedy movement that we seem to be in the midst of now. This special, Patton Oswalt did a special after his wife died called Annihilation, where he really gets into that. Gary Gulman's The Great Depression, which is about his mental illness. Um, Hannah Gadsby's Nanette was about the struggles of being gay and the discrimination and just brutal details of her life. Tig Notaro's cancer set. So, like, this is, I think, kind of a movement, if you will. And I think Hassan Minhaj really balances it. And that a bunch of you brought this up in your comments too, like the heavy with the light, right? There are those moments where you're laughing along, and he's building up this momentum, and then boom, he gets that tight, you know, that tight one shot where he's staring at you into the camera, and he gives you some truth, right? He gives you something real, something heavy to sort of balance the the, the levity and the jokes. Um, Again, I shouldn't have to tell you about it at this point, but those things aren't mutually exclusive, right? Tragedy and comedy. I mean, that's the thing with the masks in the theater. You know, they arguably go hand in hand and enhance the other. Um, so that um, he gets into like a lot of, I don't know. My notes are so scattered. Um, he talks about the complexity of the immigration policy, um, an experience defined by struggle, the immigrant experience. Again, he's giving some shape to the immigrant experience so that if you watch this, you can't just dismiss, oh, well, immigrants, and, for immigrants, you can't do that because he gives, you know, he gives you a glimpse of the humanity of everybody, you know. Um, there's just so much that he talks about the what will people think, right? The price we pay for these freedoms to live in this country. This is the price we pay, like, and just how sort of how sad it is that that is the sentiment of a lot of immigrant families. Like, we to have these opportunities, we sort of give up. We expect to be discriminated against and sort of, yeah, have to deal with this stuff all the time. Um, but the what will people think is such an interesting, because for me, and again, I guess I'm sort of predisposed to this because I'm white, but that seems like such a white uh, concern. What will people think? So to hear Hasan Minhaj talk about his immigrant father, especially, be like, what will people think? Like that's that's at the front of his. That's one of his primary concerns. Is It's kind of sad and it's frightening a little bit. Like we I, we as a country care too much about what other people think. I think Hassan Minhaj here is like exploring that and how kind of treacherous that can be, how debilitating that can be. Um, so yeah, like sort of fighting that urge to care what people think. Um, this keeps coming up this semester too. This how much of me do I have to give up to survive, to be happy, to be successful, to be, I mean, not even those things, like just to be. How much of myself do I have to give up, right? And we're talking about representation. Like Hassan Minhaj, when he was a kid, he wanted to be white. Like, why? Well, because, well, who wouldn't considering what the world looks like to a kid like Hassan Minhaj who doesn't look like that. I mean, it's almost logical. You know, Louis C.K. does that whole bit about being white. He's like, I'm not saying white people are better. They're not. They're like the worst. But it's definitely better to be white, right? you get all the you get all the perks. Um, so that just him saying that sounds so like sinister almost that he wanted to be white. But I mean, logically speaking, like that's the process. Probably a lot of people of color, kids of color, go through in their growing up, considering how they see the world through this white lens primarily, um, at least through TV and movies and all that kind of stuff. Um, I don't. I wrote this down because he's talking about immigrant, like the immigrant experience, and I'm like, that's what white America used to be like. Because I got smacked around by my parents all the time, and yeah, there used to be this like hard work and you know study like that used to be an American ideal, at least when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s. Like, so what I'm trying to say is when Hasan Minhaj was explaining all those things, I'm like, that was my childhood. And I'm far from an immigrant. My parents were far from immigrants. So what made me ask, like, what happened and how that has how that has changed, um, how slash why that changed. I don't know. Um, it's interesting. It certainly is interesting that, like, for example, like I've never hit any of my kids. So does that make me better? I don't know. I think it does. I don't know. I don't know. But my kids are going to be way more successful than me, probably. So maybe there is something to that. We'll have to wait. It's a generational thing, I guess. But it was just interesting to me that I think America, white America, for until probably the 90s, maybe, was very similar to his description of like immigrant America in terms of their relationship with their parents and parents being demanding and parents, you know, smacking their kids, slapping their kids, and parents, um, just having that fear twinged, fear tinged respect for their parents. Um, Man, there's a lot of stuff here, right? Um, I want to get to your comments too. Oh, that's not that. Okay. Uh, there's a lot of there's a lot of great stuff in here about sort of the paradox of bigotry. I think he talks about, and I wrote down like the Donald Glover story about Spider-Man, which I think I told you guys, and Patton Oswalt does a bit like that too. Like we should be better at spotting the differences between people who are just ignorant and people who are bigots, right? Like that. Like assholes are assholes, like no matter what color, gender, sexual, whatever. Um, and he talks about that a lot, like you know, like the whole Bethany Reed thing. And a bunch of you made comments about her and how he uses that character. Like the Reed family, they're almost worse than the people who like vandalized his dad's car, because it's this almost institutionalized versus just sort of, you know, um, I don't know. I don't know what the word is, but that's sort of systemic versus um, I can't think of the other word because I'm a moron. You know what I'm saying though. Just say you do. Um, yeah, that he talks a lot about that how deep seated that sort of deep seated or systemic or institutionalized racism is so different than just a bigot or an ignorant someone who just doesn't know or just doesn't hasn't taken the time to think about it. Um, and I think he does a good job of sort of um, walking us through those things. Um, so your comments were as follows. A bunch of you mentioned how he marries the heavy with the light, which I talked about before, and I think that's crucial to any good comedy. Is there has to be something for the comedy to sort of play off of, and without some sort of solemnity, it's just gonna, it kind of all washes together. So we need to be sort of dragged through uh, this um, experience, feeling the highs and lows, right? Because with no lows, there can be no highs. Everything's just even keel, and vice versa. So I think he does a good job, better than anybody we've seen so far. Of like I said, like there are moments in this, and this is to Jules' comment. There are moments in this performance when he's not joking, right? Like he's literally not making jokes. There's like a handful of those, like I talked about before. It's just like one shot, boom, close up, stare at the camera, and you know he's being heartfelt. He's being honest. He's not being funny. That arguably makes the next funny thing he says feel like a release and feel funnier, and it makes which in turn makes the next powerful moment more powerful. So like he has a great handle on the ebb and flow of the tragic and the comic, or the meaningful and the sort of silly. Um, so yeah, I was like Amon and Lewis and Jason and Hallie and Nikki and Cole, like all you guys mentioned that sort of push and pull, or the blending or marrying of the heavy and the light, I guess, for to simplify it grossly. Um, and then yeah, Jules, there are times in this performance where he's not joking, like, and I think that's worth noting too about the importance of sort of a grounding force, truth, honesty, those kinds of things are as powerful as I think make the jokes more powerful. Let's put it that way. Um, Ryan talked about, and so did Kathleen. I think just the nature of the course, and I thank you for those glowing words. It's certainly a mission of this course is, besides the stuff that we actually do, is to expose you guys to different things. I'm very happy to help in this process of, you know, exposing you to different ideas and concepts and things like that. So I'm always appreciative to hear that that is happening. So thank you for that. Um, Bia Having, oh, having difficult conversations is what I wrote. That's what I think you wrote. And like Hasan Minhaj wants to have these difficult conversations. The comedians generally want to engage in these difficult conversations, and when you do, you're exploring, not exploiting, right? Um, and that was to tie it back into my whole explore exploit uh, relationship, and he's certainly doing that, right? He's having these, we're going to have these difficult conversations. It's arguably the job of the comedian, I would say, to initiate these difficult conversations, because who else is going to do it in a forum where nobody's going to get stabbed or fucking, you know, a riot's not going to break loose, right? Um, this is the place to do it, I think. Um, Kathleen mentioned this this theme that Bo Burnham sort of started too, or at least not started, but he's sort of looped in to this concept, but the shedding of the macho, like tough guy facade of the comedian, right? That was really prevalent in the 80s, but I think is still prevalent with especially male comedians. That whole, like, you got to be super tough and alpha and all this bravado and confidence and macho. Like Hasan and Bo Burnham are both betas, right? They're sensitive, they're humble, it seems. They're the complete antithesis of that. I thought that was a really good connection that she made. Because yeah, I think it's true. I think there are more comedians that kind of fit into that mold now, which is, again, that's good too. Um, and then Courtney brought up the importance of him speaking his native tongue, if that's what it's called. I think it's Arabic. He's speaking, using those passages to connect to his heritage, his language, his religion, like all those kinds of things. I agree. I think that gives it some weight, right? A lot of that when he's speaking like that, it's sort of there's some gravity, gives it some extra gravity, right? And I think again to counterbalance with the next joke that he's going to do. Joe and Alex both mentioned, I think a couple others, this idea that this is a story. Like, it has a beginning, middle, end. The way they use Bethany Reed to sort of, she has a legit character arc in this story. It's a story. It's not just a collection of jokes, strung together haphazardly, or, there's no, like Bo Burnham. Bo Burnham mocks the sort of the sort of ridiculousness of segues. Like, okay, how do I get from one joke to the next, right? He kind of takes the air out of that whole thing. Hasan's just like, I just have a story. I don't have segues. I don't have jokes per se. I'm telling a story, and I'm a funny person, and I'm making it funny, right? And that is different. Even the storyteller comedians who turn their jokes into stories that are, maybe 5, 10 minutes long. They have it's just a collection of those. This is one narrative, one overarching story. I think that contributes to its success. So there's that. I'm glad you guys, for the most part, liked him. Hopefully, these last few weeks will be filled with more that you like.